Hello, my friends, and welcome back to the book of Judges. Today we'll look at chapters 7 through 11, and we'll start back up with our story of Gideon. Now, if you remember from the last reading we had, Gideon was threshing wheat, essentially in a cellar, basically hiding because he was afraid the men of Midian would come and take his wheat, take what he was threshing. But then an angel of the Lord appeared to him and called him a mighty warrior, which he probably took as sarcasm, and says that God is going to use him to defeat their enemies. He tests God with the fleece. We remember that at the end of the chapter 6. He tests God with the fleece. He lays the fleece out and says, if this is really what you want to do, have the fleece be soaked and the water be dry, or not the fleece be soaked and the water be dry. Have the fleece be soaked and the ground be dry, and then once God does that, he has the ground wet and the fleece dry. And so then he decides, okay, this is real. God has proved himself to me, and Gideon is ready to do what God's going to have him to do. And that's where we'll pick it up today in chapter 7. Now, Gideon begins with an army of around 32,000 men, but God actually says that's too many. And keep in mind that they're getting ready to fight against this group of well over 100,000 men. So interesting that God says that's too many. So he starts with 32,000. God says, nope, that's too many. So he famously puts them to the test. Maybe you've heard this story, maybe not. He tells them that anyone that doesn't want to be here can go home. And after that, 22,000 of them leave. So he had another 10,000 men left. And then God says, no, that's still too many. So he gives them yet another test. He says, tell the men to go and get a drink of water. The ones that put their faces in the water will be sent home, and the ones that lap the water out of their hands, so picture it like you cup the water in your hands and then you drink it that way, those guys will be the ones that you're going to fight with. And then he's left with only 300 men. So God says, all right, now you're ready. And keep in mind, remember, this battle is going to be over 100,000 men, probably closer to 200,000 or more. The Bible even says that the army was as numerous as locusts, and their camels were without number. So this was a massive army they were getting ready to fight with only 300 men. But God was in control, and he had quite a battle plan. One night, Gideon goes to spy on the Midianite army, and he overhears them talking about how God had sent dreams foretelling their defeat. So their morale was already in a pretty bad spot because God had told them, basically through dreams, that they were going to lose this battle. And then Gideon splits his force into 3 different groups and gives each man a trumpet and a flaming torch in a jar. So now normally, if you're talking about a battle and going into battle, you would only have officers that would carry a torch. And so the Midianite army, since this is the middle of the night, are going to think that they're surrounded by thousands of men. So when in reality, it's just 300 carrying trumpets and torches. And then when they blow their trumpets, smash the jars they were holding, and show all their torches, Gideon and his 300 men rout this terrified and demoralized army. And the Bible even says that they turned their swords on each other in the camp. This victory surely wasn't from military power or craftiness. This was an example of God taking care of his people and fighting for them. And after that first victory, Gideon and his army pursued the men of Midian and continued to defeat all of their enemies that they faced along the way. And after that, they had 40 years of peace during the reign of Gideon. And look at what happened next, though. I say reign of Gideon, but Gideon was a judge, not a king. And that's important because they actually asked him to be their king. They said, Gideon, because you've done this, will you be our king? And Gideon says no. Why? Because the Lord was the one that should be ruling over them. He was supposed to be their king. So Gideon does what so many men in history have not been able to do. He actually turned down more power because he wanted people to be focused on the Lord and not him. And it's a common saying, I'm going to butcher it, but it's borrowed power is not easily returned, or something like that, right? It's in human nature, typically when someone is given more power, they're not very quick to give it back. Gideon was given this power. He was leading these men, and he kind of couldn't wait to get rid of it. Gideon was a good man, and he had a lot of good traits, but he wasn't a perfect man, however. And we see that here because he had 70 sons. 70. He had many wives, and he also had concubines. And that might sound off for a man of God to have concubines, because concubines are a biblical word for basically prostitutes or women that's sole job was to please men in that way. Okay, so concubines weren't something that a man of God should really have, and certainly shouldn't have around, and certainly shouldn't be having children by, but Gideon did that. And so what we see in the story of Gideon is a good breakdown of who he was. He was a good man, but he was also a flawed man, just like the rest of us. Now, after Gideon's death, the leaderless people quickly fell back into idolatry and again fell into sin, which will be followed by slavery. But first, before we see that slavery and all that, we see the story of Abimelech in chapter 9. He's not a judge, even though he's recorded in the book of Judges, but that's because he's Gideon's son. And he's the son of a concubine, but he wants to be king. So look what he does. He persuades his Canaanite relatives to help him murder his 70 brothers, and that's exactly what he does. Only Jotham, the youngest, escapes the public execution. And after killing his brothers, Abimelech is crowned king, and it will end up being a short-lived rule. A short little note on Jotham, by the way. We'll see there, you can see there in the reading, Jotham actually has a long kind of speech that he gives after his brother has killed all the rest of their brothers. And you can read that there in the passage. But after that, Abimelech, he's crowned king, and it will end in a very short time. In fact, it would only last about 3 years. And he calls himself a king, but he was only really in charge of about 4 towns, and they were kind of small towns as well. But the people of Shechem tried to rebel against him, starting on verse 26 of chapter 9, and Abimelech responds by trapping them in a tower and setting it on fire. So he trapped all the people in the town in this tower. They thought they were going to be safe, but Abimelech said, all right, thank you, locks them in the tower and sets it on fire, killing them all. Again, what a great guy this dude was. And so then he was getting ready to do the same thing in another town full of people when a woman dropped a millstone on his head. And he knew he was going to die from the wound, so he had a young man next to him stab him, so people wouldn't say that he was killed by a woman. That's really something that you should be worried about while you're dying. But anyway, he was. And that was the end of Abimelech. But remember our common theme here that we've seen all throughout the scriptures already in just our month and a half that we've been reading. Sin comes with a price. If Gideon hadn't had his concubines, there would have been no Abimelech, and his sons would not have been murdered. Abimelech was born because of Gideon's sin. He was a product of Gideon's sin. And the price that he paid, well, it ended up not being him that paid it. It was his sons, his children, his line was basically ended because of that sin. So then we meet a couple more judges starting in chapter 10. We're moving on from Gideon. The first one is Tola, who reigned for 23 years, but it really doesn't tell us anything that he did. So theoretically, he must have been a judge at a pretty calm time for God's people. And then there was a judge named Jair, I guess that's how you say it, Jair, who was a pretty similar story. It doesn't tell us much about him, but it does say that he had 30 sons that rode on donkeys. And in this time, your wealth wasn't really determined by how much money you had, your gold, your silver, yada, yada, yada. More about livestock. So the fact that he had 30 sons and all of them were riding on donkeys meant that he was you could assume he was a man of means. He had some money, but he didn't really have much real power. And a sad life is one that's lived when you aren't living for a purpose. As Christians, we must be sure that we don't live these affluent, well-off lives and miss the high calling that God has placed on our lives. This man, Jair, was God's judge, and it seems that the only thing that he's known for was having money. And that's not what we want. We want to be known as followers of God and people that used what God gave us to do great things, because that's what God wants to do through us. And so then the rest of chapter 10 and all of chapter 11 actually begin the story of Jephthah, which is one of my favorite stories of the Bible. He's a pretty cool character. And so make sure you read this. This is chapter 10 and 11, and it'll continue even a little bit next week. And the rest of chapter 10 is all about Jephthah and moving forward. And so to give some background, the Israelites continued to indulge in Baal worship. Remember, I said that after Gideon's death, they would return to idolatry and then eventually slavery. And so the Israelites have continued in Baal worship, and God punishes them through crushing defeats at the hands of the Philistines and the Ammonites. The Ammonites not only dominate the Israelite settlements to the east of the Jordan River, but also also cross over to oppress the great tribes of the west. So Jephthah was the son of Gilead, but his mother was a prostitute. So his brothers wanted nothing to do with him and sent him away. In the midst of their oppression, Israel realized that they lacked leadership, and that was contributing to their problems. And our world today can certainly relate to this story because we have a serious lack of leadership. You can look all around, especially if you're an American and you look at our country. We have a serious lack of leadership all the way from the top down. We lack leaders, and that's a big reason why we have the problems we have in our world. And Israel was no exception. So here's Jephthah, okay? He was a great leader, but they don't like him because of where he came from. He was rejected by his family of all people, but essentially had become a Robin Hood type figure. That's how I like to see him. He was going out raiding with his band of misfits. And in their time of need, Jephthah quickly goes from exile to exaltation. He is exalted here. And it's funny how people change their opinions when they need your help. And some things never change. That's still so true today. People have no use for you when they don't need you, but then when you need you, they got all kinds of nice things to say. He negotiates with them before he agrees to help, and they agree that he will be in charge if he delivers them. So he tries to reason with the Ammonites first, trying to just basically form a treaty, make a covenant. We don't have to have bloodshed. We don't have to fight. But the Ammonites are, no, we're not doing that. And they end up going to war. Now, Jephthah has already been filled with God's Spirit, so God is going to take care of him. He is going to take care of Jephthah. He's going to take care of his people. But he is also a flawed man, as we can see by the foolish vow that he makes in chapter 11, verse 29. He vows to sacrifice the first thing that comes out of his house to the Lord. And sadly, we can see in verse 34 of chapter 11 still, that the first thing that comes out of his house was his only child, his daughter. And it's unlikely that he actually would sacrifice his daughter, because God definitely condemns child sacrifice. That is a false god kind of thing. That's a pagan ritual, child sacrifice. So it's unlikely that God would have had Jephthah really kill his daughter for him because of this vow. More likely, Jephthah's daughter was dedicated to service of the Lord. She was dedicated her whole life to serve in the temple, and she would live a state of perpetual virginity because she would be separated, set apart to God, and so she would never have a husband, never have children, and none of those things. So in making this vow to God and fulfilling it, Jephthah was taking away all of those possibilities for his daughter's future. And I do want to just really make sure we note that Jephthah was chosen by God to lead his people. God didn't need Jephthah to make that vow to have victory, to have military victory. God was already going to win the battle for them, but Jephthah wanted to help God along. And how often do we try to help God along in our lives and only cause bigger problems? Sometimes all we need to do is to trust in God and let him work in his way, in his time, and we will see the best that we could possibly hope for in our lives. And that's a takeaway for today, that we think about all the great things God has done and will do for us. And sometimes all we have to do is let him work. So that's all for today. And I'll see you back here tomorrow in the book of Psalms.